Episode 40, Missouri Gets Violent. Welcome to the Hidden and Distorted History of the Church series, where we will be looking at the historical aspects of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, also known as the Mormons. In this series, I will try and inform those unaware of the true facts of Mormon history. Last week, we discussed Martin Harris's claim that the 8 witnesses never saw or handled the golden plates, as revealed in the Burnett letter to Lyman Johnson. We also covered Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon's arrival in Far West, where they attempted to secure $100 annually in financial support from the church, and Joseph's declaration that Adam-ondi-Ahman in Missouri was the site of the Garden of Eden. This week, we expose the darker side of early Mormonism, accusations of counterfeiting on both sides, the rise of the ruthless Danites who silenced dissent through violence, and Sidney Rigdon's incendiary salt sermon, which drove enemies of the church out of Far West. Finally, we unravel the surprising spark that ignited the Mormon War, a clash of power, paranoia, and control that went beyond Joseph Smith himself. This episode peels back the layers on a pivotal, turbulent chapter in Mormon history. Part 1, Joseph points the finger. Accusations of counterfeiting were not isolated incidents in early Mormonism. In fact, such charges would persist and continue to be a source of tension among early Mormon leaders. Critics of Smith often pointed to his associations with dubious financial schemes, and there was a general sense that the Mormon leadership was involved in various shady dealings. These allegations were amplified by Smith's own financial mismanagement, particularly his ventures in Kirtland, where his leadership had led to widespread financial distress for many of the saints. The most prominent of these accusations came from those who left the church. For instance, William McClellan, who had been one of the early members and an apostle, became a critic and wrote about Smith's involvement in counterfeiting schemes. Even Martin Harris, one of the witnesses to the Book of Mormon, later expressed doubts and frustrations regarding Smith's financial practices and the rumors surrounding counterfeiting. The specific accusations of counterfeiting were related to an alleged plot by several early church leaders to engage in producing counterfeit money. David Whitmer, a former member of the church's original 3 witnesses, was among those who had left the church by 1838 and had become a vocal critic of Smith. Smith and his followers accused Whitmer, along with others who had left, of being involved in counterfeit schemes, a common criminal charge at the time in frontier America. Oliver Cowdery, who had been a key figure in the early formation of the church and the translation of the Book of Mormon, was also accused of similar crimes. Cowdery had left the church in 1838, which seemed to further fuel the animosity between him and Smith's leadership. The counterfeiting charges were particularly damaging because they attacked not just the character of these former leaders, but also their credibility as witnesses to the Book of Mormon, which Smith was still claiming to be divinely inspired. The counterfeiting accusations can be seen as an attempt by Smith and his followers to discredit these men and their allies. The charges were essentially a smear campaign, with Smith's leadership trying to vilify former members to maintain control and protect the integrity of the church's reputation. The discrediting of former leaders like Cowdery and Whitmer was part of a broader effort to solidify Smith's authority and undermine the credibility of those who opposed him. This battle for control over the narrative within the Mormon community would continue throughout Smith's life and would shape the history of the movement. As for the specific counterfeiting allegations, no concrete evidence was ever produced to definitively prove or disprove them. However, the accusations were part of a broader pattern of Smith's complex and often controversial relationships with those who disagreed with him or left the church. Whether or not Smith and his associates were directly involved in counterfeiting remains a matter of debate, but the accusations certainly left a lasting stain on their reputations and added to the tumultuous history of the early Mormon movement. Part 2, Welcome in the Danites. The Danites, a secretive militia group organized in 1838 by Samson Avard, were one of the darkest elements of early Mormonism, and Joseph Smith's involvement in them remains a point of intense controversy. Formed during the height of anti-Mormon violence in Missouri, the Danites were intended as a protective force for the beleaguered Mormon community. However, their mission quickly turned into something far more sinister, involving intimidation, violence, and a campaign of terror against non-Mormon settlers. Though Smith denied any direct involvement, numerous accounts suggest that he was well aware of the Danites' activities, possibly even giving tacit approval for their violent methods. The most telling source of evidence comes from Avard himself. In his testimony before a Missouri court, Avard revealed that Smith had knowledge of and possibly endorsed the Danites' aggressive actions. Further, Samuel Smith, Joseph's own brother, testified that Joseph gave speeches which seemed to justify the actions of the Danites. These revelations suggest that Smith was not just a passive observer but an active participant in fostering a climate of violence in the Mormon community. Critics, such as David Whitmer, an original witness to the Book of Mormon, further fueled this narrative by stating that Smith was not just aware, but complicit in the Danites' operations. Smith's role in the formation of the Danites cannot be ignored or whitewashed by defenders of the faith. The accusations that Smith used the Danites to protect his leadership, consolidate power, and eliminate opposition are hard to dismiss. Whether or not Smith directly commanded the Danites to engage in violence, his leadership and the way he manipulated those under him was the fertile ground in which such a group could thrive. This is not the stuff of divine guidance, but rather the actions of a leader whose personal ambitions and the thirst for power seem to justify any means necessary. Despite the denial from some apologists, the evidence surrounding Smith's knowledge of the Danites paints a troubling picture. His leadership was increasingly defined by coercion, secrecy, and violence, traits that would persist throughout his life and shape the way the church handled internal dissent. Whether the Danites were Smith's creation or merely his response to external threats, one thing is clear: they represent a dark chapter in the history of the early LDS movement. Smith's involvement, direct or indirect, casts a long shadow over his legacy and reveals the lengths he would go to in maintaining control over the Mormon community. In the end, the Danites are not just a footnote in Mormon history. They are a glaring example of the violent undercurrents that ran through the early days of the church. Part 3. The Salt Sermon That Stung. If the Danites were the fist of early Mormonism, Sidney Rigdon's Salt Sermon was its war cry, a blistering call to arms that intensified violence and suppression in far west Missouri. Delivered in June 1838, this sermon was ostensibly about purifying the church, but in reality, it targeted dissenters and declared open hostility toward perceived enemies of the faith. Rigdon's fiery rhetoric was not just words. It became the ideological foundation for the Danites' militant actions, marking a decisive shift toward authoritarianism within the church. Rigdon drew on Matthew 5, verse 13, proclaiming that dissenters were the salt that had lost its savor and deserved to be cast out and trodden underfoot. This metaphor, weaponized in Rigdon's hands, carried an unmistakable threat. Those who opposed Joseph Smith's leadership would face not only expulsion but also severe retribution. Historian D. Michael Quinn has noted that Rigdon's rhetoric created a combustible atmosphere in Far West, where loyalty became synonymous with survival. The immediate consequences were stark. Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer, two of the church's founding members and original witnesses to the Book of Mormon, were excommunicated in April 1838 amidst accusations of disloyalty. The Salt Sermon escalated tensions further, branding Cowdery and Whitmer as traitors unworthy of their past roles. Both men were soon driven out of Far West under duress, facing harassment and threats from the Danites. Cowdery, falsely accused of theft to justify his removal, later described the ordeal as a gross miscarriage of justice. Whitmer, in his writings, lamented the betrayal, stating, "Those who once called me brother now saw me as their enemy." Their forced departure sent a clear message: dissent would not be tolerated. The Danites, emboldened by Rigdon's sermon, became the enforcers of this policy, using intimidation and violence to suppress any opposition. Richard Bushman observes, "The expulsions of Cowdery and Whitmer exposed a church increasingly reliant on fear and coercion to maintain unity, rather than persuasion or spiritual authority." Rigdon's Salt Sermon also highlighted the growing hypocrisy within church leadership. While preaching about building a Zion of peace and righteousness, Rigdon and Smith simultaneously fostered a culture of fear. This was no coincidence. As Smith and his inner circle faced external pressures and internal dissent, they turned to authoritarian measures to retain control. The result was a community increasingly defined by loyalty tests and ideological conformity, with devastating consequences for those who failed to meet the standard. In hindsight, the Salt Sermon and the rise of the Danites stand as stark reminders of the lengths to which early Mormon leaders were willing to go to preserve their vision of the church. For Cowdery and Whitmer, their expulsion marked the end of their roles in the movement they helped to create. For the church, it was a turning point where the ideals of Zion gave way to the realities of consolidation and control. Where the Danites wielded the sword, Rigdon wielded the word, and together they ensured that the Mormon experiment in Missouri would be defined not by harmony or community, but by division and bloodshed. Part 4. Adam-ondi-Ahman to spring up. On June 28, 1838, Joseph Smith Jr., Sidney Rigdon, Lyman White, George W. Robinson, John Smith, and numerous unnamed Mormon settlers gathered to survey and divide the land, build homes, and lay the foundation for a new community. Adam-ondi-Ahman. Adam-ondi-Ahman was touted by Mormon leaders as the key to establishing a divine refuge, a sacred stake of Zion where the saints could prosper in peace. But this vision didn't last. The rapid growth of Mormon settlers in Daviess County set off alarm bells among local Missourians. To them, the Mormon migration wasn't just a peaceful settlement. It was an invasion, a challenge to their land, livelihoods, and authority. The Mormon community, already a source of suspicion due to their unorthodox beliefs and tendency to vote as a unified bloc, was seen as a threat that could not be ignored. As the Mormons expanded, the atmosphere in Daviess County became increasingly charged. Their aggressive push into the area and the rapidly growing population only exacerbated the resentment and fear among local residents. Tensions that had been simmering for months were about to boil over. The fuse was lit on July 4, 1838, when Sidney Rigdon, in a speech delivered to the saints in Far West, unleashed his infamous extermination speech. In a tone laced with anger and defiance, Rigdon declared that the Mormons would no longer stand for persecution or harassment. He didn't just warn of retaliation, he threatened a war of extermination against anyone who dared oppose them. The speech was a direct challenge to the people of Missouri, one that they could not and would not ignore. Rigdon's inflammatory words, combined with the Mormon leadership's brazen expansion into Adam-ondi-Ahman, left no room for misunderstanding. It wasn't just about building Zion. It was about a forceful claim to the land, one that would stop at nothing to secure Mormon dominance. This aggressive stance, fueled by divine ambition and sharpened by combative rhetoric, transformed what could have been a peaceful settlement into a powder keg. The aftermath of these provocations was inevitable. The Mormon leadership's fiery words and defiant actions ignited the hostilities that would evolve into the 1838 Mormon War. While the saints framed their actions as a divine mission, their approach, marked by unrelenting expansionism, reckless rhetoric, and a refusal to back down, turned them into a target. They were not victims of some unjust conspiracy. They were players in a conflict that they helped to create. This was no holy exodus. It was the fallout of ambition unchecked, a warning about the dangers of hubris, and a glimpse into the volatile future that awaited the saints. Part 5. You shall not pass go. The Mormons began settling in DeWitt and the surrounding areas in early 1838 as part of their broader, unchecked expansion into northwestern Missouri. They saw this land as part of their divine entitlement, an essential piece of the promised Zion, where they could gather the saints and establish their dominion. DeWitt, strategically located along the Grand River, was prime land for farming and seemed ripe for Mormon colonization. It was a perfect location in their eyes, not for peaceful coexistence, but for laying the groundwork of a religious empire. But this bold move quickly stirred the pot with local non-Mormons, who had already been hostile to the saints since their earlier attempts to settle in Missouri. The arrival of the Mormons in DeWitt wasn't viewed as a peaceful settlement. It was seen as an invasion, a direct challenge to the established social and political order. The Mormon presence wasn't merely an encroachment on land. It was an assertion of power, forcing their beliefs and communal bloc voting onto a population that had already grown distrustful of them. On July 14, 1838, Carroll County residents held a meeting to confront the Mormon encroachment. Fears ran high as locals realized that the Mormons, with their distinct aggressive agenda, were not just looking for a place to settle. They were looking to seize control. The Mormons had already made it clear that they were not here to fit in. They were here to dominate. With their tight-knit voting bloc and their leader-driven command, they presented a direct threat to the power structures that had long held sway in Missouri. As the summer dragged on, tensions erupted into open hostilities. More meetings were organized and the rhetoric turned violent. Threats against the Mormon settlers escalated, with local residents vowing to drive them out. The Mormons, however, showed no intention of retreating. They had not come to assimilate or coexist. They had come to claim the land as their own, to build Zion by any means necessary. The situation quickly spiraled into chaos. Local mobs, spurred on by months of simmering resentment, began forming, attacking Mormon properties and threatening violence. The Mormons' actions, far from being seen as peaceful, inflamed the situation. Their refusal to respect local authority, their unwillingness to compromise, and their total disregard for the rights of the existing population set the stage for a full-blown crisis. By the end of the summer, the Mormons were forced to abandon DeWitt, driven out by violence, threats, and a relentless campaign of intimidation. They had not been expelled because of their beliefs. They had been driven out because of their refusal to live peacefully with their neighbors. They had refused to respect the boundaries of the communities they sought to dominate. Their inability to integrate, coupled with their arrogant belief that they had a divine right to the land, led to their expulsion and further fueled the growing conflict with the people of Missouri. Let me know what you think about the events that transpired during this period in the comments section below. Please watch for future videos, and thank you so kindly for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant signing off for the day.